Hello. Welcome back to the Space Golem. Today we're going to find out what happened had Obi Wan killed his student on Mustafar. Before we begin, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else part of my team. If you want to get some limited time merch, go down below. There's Pride of the Empire and the Broken One merch out until the end of Season 1 of the Earth series. Otherwise, let's get straight into our story. It begins on Mustafar. Two brothers are interlocked in the most intense duel in millennia. The fate of the galaxy hindered on this duel. Anakin Skywalker was the chosen one, who fell so fast from his grace, and on the other side was his master, Obi Wan Kenobi, who despite his challenges certified himself as a Jedi. The two were in the final stand between good and evil. By this point, Grandmaster Yoda had lost his battle to Darth Sidious, and if Obi-Wan faltered even just a little, then the hope of the galaxy would vanish. Anakin Skywalker was far too powerful to just be allowed to rampage across the galaxy. At this point, there was no telling if Skywalker would kill Sidious or not after the duel, but Obi-Wan at this point was determined to stop Skywalker regardless. This duel was a test of the best of both of them. They've done this game several years before, years of sparring with each other and training with each other, and now it was a fight to end all fights. Obi-Wan was on a heavy defense. He couldn't push any offense against Skywalker. It made sense. Anakin was always the most aggressive Jedi Obi-Wan had ever sparred with. Of course, Obi-Wan was on the High Council, and he spent time sparring with the best of the best in the Jedi Order, and yet as a Jedi Master of defense himself, he held his own against all of them. The only difference here is that Obi-Wan knew Anakin better than anyone else. He knew Anakin's style, and he also knew that Anakin didn't have the patience to play the long game. Obi-Wan knew himself, and he was a true Jedi. He had the patience and the ability to wait this out as long as it would take to sedate Skywalker. The two had already been through the facilities, wrecking and rampaging through the various panels and controls that operated the facility. The entire structure was about to fall into the lava river, and Kenobi and Skywalker continued their fight with no attention to the world around them, crumbling below their very feet. Obi-Wan, being on defense so prevalently, was forced to backpedal his way throughout the entire battle. Anakin was an obvious aggressor, and yet over all of his time, he was able to beat Obi-Wan on various occasions, yet he never figured out the key to actually beating his master. Anakin's over-reliance on his strength made him a powerful adversary, but that only worked on Jedi or Sith who were too focused on an aggressive style of attack. Someone like Master Sindralic was easy pickings for Skywalker, while someone like Mace Windu would have given him a struggle. Anakin's power also made him incredibly patient, being that he could typically overwhelm a human duelist. He didn't have to be patient, he just needed to remain stronger than his foe, which, with Obi-Wan's case, physically was true, but mentally was not. Anakin didn't understand as much as Obi-Wan did that this duel, while yes being a test of their physical strength, was also a test of their mentality. Anakin pushed Kenobi back as the two once brothers fought to the death. This led them dueling over unstable pipes to colliding near the fiery volcanoes of the unstable world. Anakin and Obi-Wan ended up pushing their duel onto a large piece of debris of the structure that disconnected and dropped down into the lava river itself below. Skywalker and Obi-Wan climbed up the structure, only for Obi-Wan to make a quick escape, leaving Anakin to fall over a lava river. Instead, Anakin was able to jump from the platform and continue the duel with his master, hovering over the lava river. The two collided blades, using their individual platforms to hold their own until Anakin's lack of patience drove him to jump to Obi-Wan's platform. Obi-Wan and Anakin were interlocked in a duel, mere feet away from each other, no breathing room and certainly no room to falter to their opponent. The balance of the galaxy in their hands, the fate of trillions depended on the victor of this battle, and before Anakin's overbearing strength could do anything, his master switched from his famed Form 3 and transferred it into the same form that his master used. Kenobi used Form 4 and put himself into an offensive striking position. The switch was so sudden and fast that Anakin had not a chance to recoil from his aggressive assault and defend himself. Anakin's blade swung, missing Obi-Wan, but his master didn't miss his opportunity to beat Darth Vader. Obi-Wan's blade slammed into Anakin's stomach, and his yellow, piercing eyes looked up into Obi-Wan's. The moment was still. Anakin was too full of shock to do anything. He just massacred hundreds of Jedi in the temple without trouble, and he was under the misconception that he was the most powerful being in the galaxy. And here he was, with a lightsaber hole in his body. Anakin's lightsaber fell from his hand into the lava river below. Obi-Wan looked into Anakin's eyes and apologized for failing him. Before Anakin could even catch a moment to comprehend, his body fell out from under him, and he tumbled back into the heated abyss below. Skywalker's last memory would consist of Obi-Wan's courageous blue eyes, daunting a terrible sadness behind them, under the haziness of a heartfelt apology. Obi-Wan would look over the edge and sheath his lightsaber once he saw the hand of Skywalker etching out of the river below, being sucked down into the darkness. Obi-Wan made his way back to the ship. There was darkness coming, and Obi-Wan knew he didn't have the energy to hold that fight, especially not by himself. When Kenobi returned to Padme's vessel, she was already safely secured, and so the ship abandoned Mustafar mere moments before the Dark Lord the Sith arrived. It would take time, but Padme would arrive at Polis Massa, and she would have the distinct fortune of being able to give birth without dying. The only reason being that Darth Sidious couldn't transfer her life into Anakin, because Anakin was just dead. There was nothing left for Sidious to find as he searched for Skywalker's body for hours. The only hope of finding Skywalker's body to Sidious is the fact that he could possibly clone him. But unluckily for him, Kenobi killed him over the lava river, and his body and power was lost forever. Sidious was inconsolable, so much raw potential wasted away by a Jedi that Sidious believed to be weak. On Polis Massa, Padme would wake up in the transcendent lights of the iridescent medical bay. Her vision was foggy and her confusion amounted in her mind. Though her friend was by her side, Obi-Wan Kenobi waited for her to wake up, and then when she did, her first question went to her husband. Was Anakin alright? Was he safe? Obi-Wan informed her that he had perished on Mustafar. Her sadness was certainly present, yet coming to terms with everything didn't really collect in her mind. She still hadn't really remembered her last moments with Anakin, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe she would simply remember the Anakin that the galaxy needed to remember, the kind man who was a hero not just to the clones, but to the galaxy, the man who cared for his friends and loved those around him, a man who could simply kill with kindness and compassion, the angel who fell from grace, dragged to the depths of hell never to be seen again. Something truly poetic was about it, but the time was now for the Jedi and the galaxy to move forward. They couldn't wait on the past to return, because it had come and gone. Instead, they needed to focus on what the future would hold not just for them, but for the children that came after them. The Sith were still a threat, and the Empire even more so. Obi-Wan, having seen his apprentice, his only student, die by his own hands, was truly struggling, but he knew that he couldn't let his pain overwhelm his need to do good in the galaxy. Yoda was ready to recede and disappear into desolation on Dagobah, but Obi-Wan wasn't having it. Obi-Wan told Yoda that since Padme was alive, they needed to kill the Sith. Palpatine would come for her. If he did, then Luke and Leia would be subjected to a life of much more pain than they could ever imagine. Yoda understood. With Anakin truly dead, the Sith would rise, and they would hunt the Jedi and kill those who opposed them. Without a ruler, the Empire could possibly overcome its shortfalls. That much was unknown, but Kenobi knew that they just couldn't let Sidious stay in power, telling Yoda that they should have faced him together. Now that he was weak, they had their opportunity to kill him. Yoda told Obi-Wan that Sidious would fight like a cornered crate dragon. Obi-Wan accepted that and told Yoda that if he died in the service of the galaxy, then it would be worth it. If he died so that Luke and Leia could have a future that their father couldn't, then he would do it. Because that's what it meant to be a Jedi. To shrivel away in cowardice when the odds were against them was not the Jedi way. That was the way of the Sith. They had for millennia. The Jedi are noble in their quest for the betterment of those who cannot defend themselves. Yoda looked at Obi-Wan and felt shame course throughout his veins. Obi-Wan continued telling Yoda that it was the way of the Jedi to walk the fine line between chivalry and insanity, because they had the strength to do it. Yoda frowned. He knew Obi-Wan was right. He just couldn't accept that he failed, not just once, but twice. Obi-Wan told Master Yoda that he would face Sidious alone if Yoda did not join him. Obi-Wan refused to allow the galaxy to be haunted by a man who had no issue killing trillions in a war he started to achieve more power. What would stop him from doing worse? Killing entire civilizations, destroying planets, enslaving numerous more. What more could the Jedi allow him to do? They failed once and they did not have the chance to fail again. Yoda looked up at Obi-Wan, who turned around and began talking to Bail, asking him to take the children and Padme to Alderaan, and then take him to Coruscant. Bail was quite moved by Obi-Wan's speech. It made Bail feel like he could even wield a lightsaber and take on Sidious himself. While one may ask if it was brainwashing or ignorance, the truth is, that was who Obi-Wan was. He was inspiring. Bail was ready to wage war on a foe that had just revealed themselves to be the biggest threat the galaxy had ever seen. Bail was ready, and so he looked down at the little green Grand Master of the Jedi, who told him that he would be joining them on this crusade. The Jedi, not long after, with Bail, Padme, Luke, and Leia, would depart for Alderaan. When they arrived, Raya Organa and the Royal Guard would take Padme and her children in. Bail would then take the two Jedi to Coruscant so that they could fight off the last Sith. While on the vessel, Obi-Wan and Yoda would meditate in harmony. Yoda would do something he hadn't done in so long, something he had forgotten about since his mission to Vajun decades before. Yoda would begin a battle meditation. One would think he would use it before his battle with Sidious, but Yoda acted rash. He didn't act like a Jedi, he acted out of vengeance, allowing himself to become weak to the Sith he fought. Not this time, though. The battle meditation had its purpose, and it was meant to make those ready for battle stronger. While in the past, battle meditation was used for armies, fleets, and the greatest battles the galaxy had ever seen. Yoda was here using it for his companion in combat. This would give Kenobi the extra oomph he may or may not need to take on Sidious. When the two Jedi arrived on Coruscant, their presence was toxic to the Sith Lord, though the Jedi knew exactly where he was. Sidious was inspecting the Jedi Temple, a place of which would come to build his new throne. Of course, his political offices were nice, but Sidious wanted a throne in the halls of the greatest adversary he ever had. He would claim the temple as his own and build himself a shrine to himself in the same place that his enemies young were slaughtered, and in the same place where he turned his enemy's greatest ally against them. While he didn't have an apprentice anymore, Sidious knew it would only be a matter of time until he found himself someone worthy of being a student. Sidious's Royal Guard walked with him. There was a squad of shock troopers with Commander Fox guarding the entrance of the temple. They had been stationed there after the members of the 501st that were stationed there were found slaughtered. When Kenobi and Yoda arrived, they felt Sidious's presence and they marched on the temple. They didn't give Fox or his men a chance to surrender. They massacred them, because the clones didn't take prisoners, not to mention that there were new bodies, all of them Padawans, slaughtered by Fox and his squad. It wasn't revenge for the Jedi, it was simply just. The two Jedi Masters, with their robes covering their heads, walked into the temple, and when they entered the great halls they saw him. Sidious turned around with his Royal Guard with him and snickered to himself. He saw that Yoda was ready to die, and he saw his chance to exact revenge on the Jedi that took away his greatest pride, being Anakin Skywalker. Before the Royal Guard could do anything, they were lifted from their feet and thrown across the temple halls, slamming into pillars and dying instantly. Kenobi and Yoda dropped their robes and ignited their weapons, and readied themselves for combat. The Dark Lord of the Sith ignited his lightsaber and howled, leaping across the room. This was something neither Jedi had experienced. It worked well against AC-10 and Anakin Kolar, but Master Yoda and Kenobi weren't so easy to beat. Kenobi was still the master of Form 3, and Yoda, well, he was still Yoda. The Sith Lord pushed an aggressive front on the two Jedi, dragging his blade across the floor, swinging violently at the Jedi, trying to create a distraction of some sort. Obi-Wan was quick on his feet, ducking under every strike made by Sidious. Yoda leapt in, striking every which way, trying to take an advantage away from the Dark Lord of the Sith. Sidious began leaping around. Yoda matched his speed, keeping up with the Dark Lord, as Kenobi did his best to hold his own, doing so in each possible way. The Sith Lord had enough of playing around when he tried to kill the Jedi. He was fooled by his own strength. Kenobi was a terrific duelist. While sure he didn't match up to the power of the Force that Sidious had, he was able to hold his own. Sidious then shot lightning from his hands at both Jedi, and they held their own, blocking the electricity flying from the Dark Lord's hands. The Sith Lord began to cackle. Yoda looked over at Obi-Wan and they nodded, both moving side by side, closer together, as Obi-Wan took in all the electricity to his lightsaber, and Yoda climbed up Obi-Wan's back and leapt off of him into the air. Sidious's eyes shot open, as he moved to shoot lightning at Yoda. The moment the lightning left Kenobi, he ran forward and swung towards Sidious, who had just shot the lightning at Yoda instead, sending the Grand Master flying from his location in the air into a pillar nearby. Obi-Wan's strike landed true, cutting through Sidious, killing him instantly. The Dark Lord dropped to the ground lifelessly. Obi-Wan made sure Sidious was dead by removing the Sith Lord's head in the least violent way he could, before turning over to see Yoda on the ground. Obi-Wan ran over to Master Yoda, who was coughing weakly, and he looked faint. Obi-Wan got down on his knees and told Yoda to hang in there. He would get him to a medical facility. Yoda put his hand up, telling Obi-Wan that he had completed his fight. The Force was calling him, and it was time for him to become one with the Force. Obi-Wan told Yoda that he needed him for this fight. Yoda simply shook his head, putting his hand on Obi-Wan's, telling him, the last of the council he was. Fill the role of Grand Master, he must. Obi-Wan took in the responsibility before Yoda died in his arms. Kenobi sighed as Yoda's body disappeared in the Force. Before he could leave, he heard rattling of a gunship. Obi-Wan looked over and saw a gunship of a clone squad he really didn't want to deal with. Before the opening of the temple was blasted open, Kenobi jumped up, and poured in was the elite squad of clone troopers called the Molinist 10. They were led by Captain Fordo. The troopers ran in and found Sidious on the ground. The clones immediately went in to resuscitate him, as they must have been called in by Commander Fox to deal with the Jedi. Obi-Wan looked over and knew that these clones would kill more Jedi. It broke his heart, because he'd worked with Fordo a couple of times, but Kenobi reached out his hand from the walkway he was on, hiding behind, and cracked the bottom of a pillar next to the clones, who were deafened by the sounds of the medical machines shooting electricity into Palpatine's chest. While the clones of the Molinist 10 were typically hyper-aware, they were focused on their mission objective at the moment, and that was bringing the Chancellor/Emperor back to life. He was cut in the neck, but it wasn't really noticeable, and they just tried their best to bring him back to life until the clones looked up to a pillar falling towards them. The clones tried to get out of the way, but most of the 10 were crushed. A few of the ARC troopers were able to get out, though not enough to not be completely crushed. But they were all in various ways trapped by the pillar. The clones had nowhere to go, and they were trapped. The gunship landed and the pilot jumped out trying to help them. The diversion was enough for Kenobi to escape and make his way back to the Tantive 4, of which he would eventually take him back to Alderaan. While the advantage was the Sith were dead, the disadvantage was a power vacuum in the Empire. Mas Amedda, Palpatine's strategic advisor and longtime loyalist to Palpatine, would take the role and try and fill the void left by Palpatine's vacancy, though problems would begin to immediately arise. While months would pass by and Obi-Wan would continue to hide out on Alderaan, there would be a galactic civil war. Well, in all actuality, it would be the continuation of the Clone Wars. A second Clone War, if you will. This occurred because of the vacancy left by the war criminal Palpatine himself. The former Separatist alliance decided that they would try and hold their own, especially after the Empire marched onto Sereno and destroyed the entire city full of innocent people, who, while yes supported the Separatists, were just civilians. The people of the Separatist Alliance activated one of their super tactical droids, and now the droid named Kraken was in control of the entire Separatist military. The truth is, the Separatists had a lot more numbers than they used during the war. Kraken served personally with Count Dooku until Dooku began to use the Providence-class destroyer called the Invisible Hand. Kraken, on the other hand, was still in control of a great fleet. And with the news of Tapoka City being melted into the bottom of the Kaminoan seas, Kraken believed that they had the opportunity to become victorious against the Empire, especially with the report that the Empire is phasing out the highly elite clone trooper program. The war began through a small skirmish on Cato Nemodia, where Kraken ambushed the Wolf Pack and wiped them all out, killing most of the entire battalion, leaving just enough survivors to warn the Empire. The ambush killed the clones that betrayed their Jedi general. Commander Wolf by this point had abandoned the army, but most of the men that he and Plo Koon served with during the war died to this ambush. Kraken took his armies and vanished into space. The clones were genuinely surprised to hear about this, considering their leader, Palpatine, had promised a new era of Imperial reign that didn't look to be too hot at the moment. Another development was the survival of Darth Maul, who currently just went by Maul, who was using the Crimson Dawn to begin a criminal empire in the Outer Rim. The criminal empire began to do well, especially with Imperial focus drifting toward a second iteration of the Clone Wars. Maul's second-in-command, Dryden Voss, was an extremely excitable man who was willing to do whatever it took to obey his master's command. Crimson Dawn grew, and the pirates in the Outer Rim were called to join their cause, all of them except for Hondo Anaka and a few others. As the second iteration of the Clone Wars began to heat up, the Separatists under super tactical droid Kraken began to squeeze their victories out. Of course, the clones had tight competition, but once the Separatists began to face down the stormtroopers, the tide of the war began to switch. This, of course, was a gradual process that didn't happen in a mere matter of weeks, rather an elongated period of months. Mas Amedda began to eat flack from his constituents and the struggle the Empire was facing at the hands of the Separatist rebellion. Even more than that, Amedda assigned Tarkin to assume complete militaristic control of the Empire. This was both a good and poor choice. Tarkin was brilliant at being loyal to the Empire, though as a tactical officer, he was rather awful to put it lightly. He got captured during the Clone Wars with the Jedi Master. Not many captains or admirals got captured during the war to begin with. Many would have fought till the end. Tarkin was cowardice, and he had a seething demeanor to anyone in his presence. But that did not make a good leader. The Empire struggled where the Republic didn't, and it became ever so apparent to the public of the Empire, who now lived in fear, that the issue wasn't indeed the Jedi, rather the issue was the leadership of the Republic. The public often saw Mas Amedda with Palpatine. As Palpatine's protege, he helped elongate a war that ended under the Jedi. As Kraken and his separatist forces began to make quick work of the Outer Rim battalions, such as the 327 Star Corps, who executed Aayla Secura, or the Galactic Marines who decimated Ki-Adi-Mundi, the Empire began to recede into the Mid-Rim. Their failure was present in the eyes of the public. Part of it was a morale thing. The clones, while being controlled by their inhibitor chips, were beginning to struggle with their actions at Order 66. They were not mindless droids, they were human beings, and a year after the war ended, many of them saw their actions as wrong, considering many of them lost great friends in the Jedi. All of them lost a home on Kamino, and many of them heard of clones being executed by Imperial officers who had very little regard for the clones to begin with. One of the more infamous Imperial officers was Vice Admiral Rampart, who very literally brown-nosed his way around Tarkin to achieve more power in the Empire. A lot of clones had, of course, all of those issues, and yet the most prevailing factor was that Imperial stormtroopers were being mixed in with clone troopers, and they didn't like that. Not one bit. Stormtroopers were just normal people. They disrespected the clones and saw themselves as better than the clones, because the clones were, well, clones. They didn't take too lightly to this, as the clones put it, as the public turned against the Empire, as did the clones, and one by one, clone trooper battalions would turn into rebels of the Empire. A clone rebellion would surge in the heat of the Second Clone War, clones showing their true value in the eyes of the galaxy, as they slaughtered stormtroopers and then shortly thereafter, their officers. While clones weren't siding with the Separatists, they also weren't siding with the Empire. Not that the clones knew anything about governing, but they sure as hell realized that the Empire was the fruit of their suffering, and now the Empire was going to suffer because they no longer had the superior fighting force called the Clone Army. The clones would mutiny their vessels, they would kill their officers, and then they would take their fleets and armies and abandon the front lines of combat. This led the Empire with little to nothing. They had various fleets and support ships filled with all recruits and loyalists of the Empire, but that didn't amount to all of what the clones had just run off with. The only advantage the Empire had was a few Star Destroyers that still existed in their ranks. Without the Star Destroyers, they had pretty much nothing. They had armies, but those armies couldn't handle the Separatist forces, let alone the mind of a super tactical droid like Kraken, responsible for some of the worst defeats for the Republic during the First Clone Wars. Kraken was simply following his elite programming, and once the clones were no longer a part of the Second Clone War, he no longer saw them as enemies, simply the gray in a black and white war. The Jedi across the galaxy, much like Maul, succeeded the most because of the Second Clone War. The Jedi were no longer being hunted, and without Sidious, Vader, or the Inquisitorius, they had no problem evading stormtroopers. Clones, on the other hand, were superior fighters, but many clones, especially those who executed Jedi they loved, like brothers and sisters, had no desire to hunt the Jedi. Because whether it was a good general or a bad general, the Jedi were on the front lines with them, and that was true honor. The clones respected that, at the very least, about the Jedi. That the Jedi fought when no one else had the courage to do so. On Alderaan, the children of Skywalker would be raised. Padme would return to public eye with Bail, but Mas Amedda leading the Empire, the hope for change was lost. He was a puppet of Palpatine's machine, and the Separatist war machine crushed Imperial resistance. Stormtroopers stood no chance, and they were mercilessly killed by battalions of battle droids. It seemed as if Dooku had a backup plan if Sidious betrayed him. It's a shame Dooku never got to see it through. But he did get to destroy the Republic, now the Empire, from the afterlife. The Second Clone War would see the Empire begin to collapse upon itself. Where it was strong as a republic, it was fragile as an empire. Civilians called for a ceasefire when their worlds burnt to the ground by the Separatists. Total war worked in the favor of a fighting force with no human limitations. The clones couldn't do it, not forever at least. The droids could, they didn't feel anything, and they surely didn't care about humans being sacrificed for victory. The Jedi felt truly terrible for the people of the Empire who suffered, but most of the survivors were only Padawans and younglings. They had no say in this fight. The Empire would have one last stand over Coruscant, and they would be slaughtered. Admiral Tarkin and Masameda would be executed in front of the public by the super tactical droid Kraken himself. Because Kraken's objective was victory, once he conquered Coruscant, he became nearly dormant. His armies and fleets after a year and a half of hard-fought combat would remain over Coruscant and wait for a former separatist government official to come in and exact a peace treaty. For most of the senators of the Empire, this wouldn't be a difficult concept to accept, though those still loyal to the Empire and to Palpatine would be thrown in jail for their crimes against the galaxy. Those who came together saw Palpatine as a war criminal, and while yes, the Separatists didn't care for the Jedi because they sided with the Republic, they too were victims of Palpatine's plot. And so, the Confederacy of the Democratic Republic would decide to renounce the order to kill all the Jedi. This only affected the few clones that still served with the Empire, the droids who served with the Separatists, and now the surviving stormtroopers who now served the CDR. This new central government was fragile, and it required everyone's loyalty. The clones who still existed in the outskirts of space would have a hard time trying to come back to this new government, though as they existed quietly out in the Outer Rim, they accidentally would find themselves running into a pirate organization that decided they were enemies. The clones didn't stand for it, and so a small war began between the clones and the pirates in the Outer Rim. This across the galaxy would become known as the Clone Restitution War. Many people, especially those of the former Republic, saw the clones as heroes. Those of the former Separatists believed the clones were fighting on behalf of the CDR because they were fighting the pirates, though the truth is, they were just fighting because the pirates fought them. When the news reached Alderaan, Kenobi, who hadn't forfeited the ways of the Jedi, knew what he needed to do. The last Sith was in the Outer Rim, and he needed to be dealt with. The only reason Kenobi knew Maul was alive was because he had encountered Rex and Ahsoka, who informed him that the Sith had escaped the Venator before it slammed down into an isolated moon in the middle of space. Obi Wan would take a single-person fighter and depart from Alderaan on his way to the Outer Rim to find Maul and to kill him. Crimson Dawn was a powerful foe, but the combined power of all the crime lords couldn't attest to the raw strength of the clones who manned every vessel and every weapon they had available. With the war heating up in the Outer Rim, and each skirmish getting deadlier and deadlier than the last, Obi-Wan Kenobi would sneak through the front lines of battle and find his way on Numidian Prime, the last holdout of Crimson Dawn. While the clones weren't really doing this for anyone, they believed Crimson Dawn should be stopped. It went against their values as individuals and as clones. As the clone army began landing on the ground outside the final holdout, Kenobi would find a hidden location to land his vessel on. He used his electro binoculars to look at the siege. The clones were being led by who other than Commander Cody. It certainly brought back some hard memories for Kenobi, but when he saw Cody's men get pushed back, he was ready for battle. Cody wasn't just leading the 212th, he was leading a collection of men from different battalions, though it wasn't as colorful as it would have been had it been the first Clone War. The armor was all white, and all the color that they used to have was now gray, but the mannerisms of Cody were recognizable to Kenobi even from a distance. And then as the push started, out came a red lightsaber. Maul began to cut through the clone force. Obi-Wan lifted up from the ground upon instinct and fluttered down with his robes trailing behind him, running through the lines of clone troopers, disregarding if they may shoot him or not. Darth Maul cut down a clone trooper after another. Commander Cody was thrown from his feet as he looked up into the yellow eyes of death bearing down on him. Darth Maul's piercing yellow eyes were the stuff of nightmares. The Sith brought his lightsaber around as a means to kill Cody. As Cody tried to raise his blaster, it was cut from his hands. Cody in a solitary moment accepted his fate, and as he closed his eyes, he heard the ignition of his second lightsaber. Cody looked up, and standing above him was a face he thought he'd never see again. Obi-Wan threw Maul off his balance and onto his back. Kenobi swung forward, barely missing Maul. Cody was filled with shock. He saw the blue lightsaber, and he saw the hair of an aged Obi-Wan Kenobi in front of him. Maul backpedaled and got to his feet, leaping back and colliding with Kenobi once more. Cody looked around and rallied the men into their final push. The pirates were gunned down, and the clones passed by their former general as he continued his duel with Maul. The age-old rivalry would die today, with Maul or Kenobi being victorious. Cody got back to his feet and grabbed a blaster from the ground and aimed at Maul. The Sith noticed this and began to pull Cody in towards him. The clone commander panicked. Obi-Wan saw this and moved in the way of Cody, making sure Cody didn't die. Obi-Wan blocked a strike and then parried the Sith, making a switch into Form 4, the same form that his master had used before being gutted by Maul on Naboo. Kenobi and Maul pushed back and forth as Cody dropped back after being released from the Force. Maul then noticed Obi-Wan's stance. It was the same as Qui-Gon's. He snickered to himself and struck forward in the same three-point saber combo as he had before. But this time, Kenobi had anticipated the move, and cut through Maul, killing him in an instant. Obi-Wan watched the body of Maul fall to the ground, completing the legacy that should have belonged to his student. Obi-Wan turned around and looked at Cody, who had removed his helmet and dropped it to the ground. Cody asked how he survived. Obi-Wan simply smiled and told him that it didn't matter. That time had come and gone. Cody tried to apologize, but Obi-Wan told him there was no need to apologize. Before reaching out his hand, Cody took it, and Obi-Wan brought him in for a hug, and told him, "Brothers, till the end." Cody blinked, and when they left the hug, Kenobi vanished. Cody looked around trying to see if he could find Obi-Wan, but he had left. This little moment would remain a treasure for Cody, someone who believed he was responsible for the death of someone who saved his life more times than he could count, and never had any resentment towards him for his actions. Obi-Wan departed back for Alderaan. The galaxy would see radical change, and instead of spending his time raising the Skywalker children with Padme, Obi-Wan would gather the Jedi on Tython, and from there, a new order would rise. Obi-Wan accepted the role of Grand Master and would rebuild what was lost. The Confederacy of the Democratic Republic would rise from the ashes of war and find itself in an era of peace. It would take time, it would take community, and it would take the growth from all sides of the galaxy. But they would rebuild. The clones would get their due respect for everything they had done, and they would be released from their servitude, free to choose a life of their own. While it would take some accommodation sponsored by the CDR, they would be free. The galaxy would rise to a prosperous era, not seen since the days of the High Republic. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jonathan, Pimp Daddy Bane, Darth, Cheesy, Apollo, Madman Stews, Anakin003, Lemon Knight, and Flan Van Cease for supporting the channel. Hit dozen likes on this video. I don't know what's coming next, but it is. If you want to see a what if, I don't know what's coming next, but write it down below. If you want to see, if you want to support me in other ways, check out the Twitch community, Discord, and Patreon. And otherwise, we got merch down below. Go check out the other channels that are showing up here. Go check out the merch. We've got tons of new merch. I plan on releasing new merch at some point soon. The Pride of the Earth is a limited time shirt, as so is the Broken One shirt. Both of those will be available until Season 1 of the Earth series is over. And let's talk about our video today. So it's a fun concept, I suppose. I know not everyone likes when Anakin dies. But I decided to do something different. I decided instead of doing a focus story on Obi-Wan, I wanted something different to happen. I feel like this is something that's so far to left field that is really, actually, I think it's really cool. I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna toot my horn for a minute. Do people still say that? I don't know. But like, I'm gonna toot my own horn for a minute because, like, honestly, I think this is a really cool concept. Like another Clone War, like a second Clone War, and the clones kind of like, after having like a year to process what happened between them and the Jedi and the war and all that stuff, you know, and the spoilers for Bad Batch, obviously, but like, we see some of that begin in well, one, the first season of Bad Batch, but also in the second season of Bad Batch. And I think a lot of some of this information is inspired by the new season of Bad Batch. But I believe like kind of taking what we've seen the clones to do in the Disney canon and kind of going from there, and like kind of, I mean, it's partial like canon, and it's also partial Legends, because in Legends there was the Clone Rebellion on Kamino, but I took that Clone Rebellion and I kind of just spread it across the galaxy, if you see what I mean. And like, I think that creates an interesting dynamic, because the Empire isn't strong without the clones. Like, they don't have a strong enough force with the Imperial Stormtroopers, and like, I don't think Stormtroopers are like trained well enough to deal with battle droids that have only been shut down for like a couple months. And you know, super tactical droids are like deadly. They are vile. They are vile droids, and they're really good at gooding. Like, they're good at doing what they do. So I figured like having a super tactical droid being in charge of the Separatists is like almost like a flawless plan, because the super tactical droid doesn't have like any human flaws. Like, Admiral Trench had human flaws. Dooku had human flaws. Even Grievous had human flaws. Even though he's like technically a cyborg, he wasn't perfect, and he still made his mistakes. But a super tactical droid is programmed to literally be perfect, like be perfect in every percentage wise. And I think a super tactical droid commanding the Separatists would lead the Separatists to actually avenge a victory. And you know, so I hope you all enjoyed. I thought this was a cool story, so I hope you feel the same way about it. As for Luke and Leia being raised, you know, we've done enough stories kind of focusing on that, and that's kind of what I wanted to do. Was I wanted to focus on a bigger concept than just Luke and Leia training together. And essentially, Obi-Wan becomes the chosen one in this story. I mean, he kills Anakin, he kills Sidious, he kills Maul. And I'm not trying to hype up Obi Wan. I mean, he wins the battle with Sidious because Yoda is there. That's the only reason why he wins. I don't think Obi Wan could beat Sidious alone. I think out of 100 times, he might beat Sidious like 20 of those times, but not like Sidious is winning 80% of the time. That's what I'm saying. So like it would be very rare that I could see Obi Wan actually beating Sidious in a one-on-one scenario. But you know, I'm not trying to hype up Kenobi. I'm not trying to make him invincible, and I want to make sure I'm clear about that. It's just like, I think with that momentum going forward, if he had that momentum, I think he and Yoda could have defeated Sidious, and then it'd just be a matter of him fighting Maul, which we already know he can beat Maul thanks to Rebels. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like down below, do the whole thing. Anyways, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, may the Force be with you.